Okay, any questions before we get started? Well, we've got about 45 minutes here. I'm going to start with this. Remember, this is an example of constructivism, right? So if realism and liberalism, they're both very state-centric, right? They're really focused on nation states. They don't really, I mean, liberalism does have a big focus on international organizations, right? But for the most part, we say that these are state-centric theories. They see states as the primary actors. Neither one of them had a real great explanation of 9/11, for example. That was a non-state actor. And both realism and liberalism agree that the international system is anarchic, meaning there's no higher authority above the nation state with the ability to enforce rules upon the nation state, right? So what about the role of ideas, though? So the way this came up, the way constructivism came up was these events here. The Berlin Wall falls, and a couple of years later, the Soviet Union ends. And actually, I have one more video to show you. But let me show you about like what you're going to see in this video. So this is the same concert. Oh, no, sorry, this is not the concert. This is actual footage from when the Berlin Wall was coming down. So this is actual footage from 1989. It's set to a song that they may have made the song like the following year or so. But the footage is actually footage from 1989. And what you're going to see are people, crossing the wall. This was a wall, if you would get shot just 6 months before, a year before, they would shoot you if you tried to cross from East Germany over to the West. So if you think about that, like this is 40 years of the Cold War, 40 years. Everybody was terrified of the mutually assured destruction idea, I mean, that was supposed to prevent countries from using the bomb, but, there was this idea that nuclear war could happen and the end of the world could happen at any moment. And people lived with this fear for 40 years. Okay, so when the Berlin Wall came down, that's what it symbolized. The end of 40 years of terror, that the world was going to end in nuclear war. And, that's why this is such an emotional moment. I have to try to explain because sometimes I see this video and I still get a little choked up. So if you see me get choked up, that's why. Somebody could hit the front lights for us again. And I'll explain a little bit more about why I get choked up too. So when the Berlin Wall was put up, is there fun?
I think maybe 1950.
60s, sometime in the 60s. I forget the exact year. Yeah.
August 13th.
1961.
So there's still some kind of barrier between East and West Germany before then.
Before 61, I don't know. Maybe.
Because I felt like the Iron Curtain was around before.
Well, I think the Iron Curtain is kind of more metaphorical for that general area. So, for the general divide between.
And also throughout parts of the video, I've noticed that the East German guards, the guys with the uniforms, they looked a bit confused as what they were doing. Some of them tried to stop the
Yeah.
Others just didn't care. In one part, when they were pushing the gate, 2 of them tried to push the gate a bit closer to the crowd in order to let the crowd overwhelm them.
Yeah, it was really confusing. Some explanations I've heard is like that there was some order. What was that? Something I read that I had not encountered before. There was some misunderstanding of some order. So yeah, that confusion definitely makes sense. I was also wondering, is anybody going to ask me like, how much did the world see this coming before it happened? And the answer is, we did not see it coming. Or at least a lot of people, no one really saw it coming. Yeah, this was momentous. When this happened, it was just, yeah, Samira. Oh, sorry, I thought you had your hand up. Yeah.
Right. Just a general decrease in tensions around that time whenever the Berlin Wall fell. Like I thought whenever Gorbachev entered office,
Yeah,
there was a lot of, like decreased tensions with the Cold War and like Western culture.
Yes. But still, we didn't expect this. It was amazing when that happened. But yeah, Gorbachev was definitely, he was moving in that direction, right? But So the Berlin Wall falls in 1989. I forget what month it was. I think it might have been spring. Yeah, it was November. November. Okay. And then the USSR still exists for a little while, but then it collapses in December. They had elections in September, and then it collapsed. So this is a really great explanation about the power of an idea, right? And the reason why I get so emotional whenever I watch this video, and it's been happening for the past couple of years where I've showed this video in my class and I get choked up and I always get really embarrassed. But the reason is because that's that video I was playing before class too. It was that the tide is changing, So I got to witness this. I was younger than y'all are, but I'm pretty old. So I remember when this happened. Of course, I didn't know all the politics of what it meant, but I knew, because everybody knew it, because it was in the air generally, that something momentous was happening. The tide was turning. Something incredibly big was changing about the world. And everybody knew that, even little kids. So I guess the reason why I get choked up is because y'all haven't experienced anything like that. You haven't experienced something that was so happy and so jubilant, where the world, we really felt like liberal democracy as a form of government had won out over authoritarian systems. It seemed like that was the end of authoritarianism. And that's why there was this guy, Francis Fukuyama. He was a podcast, he's still alive, but he wrote this book back then called The End of History, by which he meant not that there was not going to be any more history, but meaning end as in the goal or the aim. So he meant the end of history is that history was moving towards this goal. Human history was moving towards this goal of becoming more democratic, more liberal. Authoritarianism was increasingly seen as such an illegitimate system that it wasn't going to be around anymore. So that's the unipolar, the unipolar moment. So, we're kind of conflating US hegemony at the end of the Cold War, but there was also this idea that democracy had won out. And so it was an incredibly happy moment for the whole world. And since y'all haven't experienced that, things are very different right now. And it's sometimes very scary. I just want you to have this in your head, that the tide can turn back. We can get back there. We may have to go through some bad stuff before then, but it's never the end. The story is never over. So no matter how bad things get, I want y'all to remember that that happened, that moment happened.
Yeah, dark age for me.
Hope that we wouldn't have to relearn lessons of history generations, but it seems like we do. Yeah. Okay.
Also, I also remember in an autobiography about Putin that Putin was there when that happened, and that kind of influenced how he's doing things now.
Interesting.
He was a KGB agent under the East German Stasi, and
Germany.
something about communication issues that they were going to allow Germany to reunify, but it was going to be on a different day. And then the people just went out and knocked down the wall, and there was chaos among the secret police, and went back to Russia, and here we are.
Yeah. So the power of an idea. That's the main idea. So realism and liberalism could not explain what we just watched there, right? So constructivism kind of develops out of this idea, the end of the Cold War. Realism couldn't explain it because the Cold War didn't end because one side triumphed militarily over the other, right? And the Cold War didn't end because international institutions or organizations were there to help the countries resolve their dispute. I mean, they were there, but it didn't help any. So liberalism's explanation didn't work. I mean, they could only provide like partial explanations. Really, people in IR theorists were thinking we need a new approach, a new theoretical paradigm to explain what just happened. And the only thing that we can think of is it's the power of an idea. There was this concept, soft power became a concept then. This guy named Joseph Nye, soft power. Does anybody know a definition of soft power? It's You know what it is, right? What is it?
Like a textbook definition of soft power?
Well, yeah, that's what I was gonna get to. I mean, you know what it is, right?
Yeah.
But it's actually, so it's the attractive allure. It's an attraction. It's always a positive thing. Sometimes people misuse it to mean, that it's, just anything other than military pressure, but it's not. It's specifically a positive thing. Blue jeans and Coca-Cola. That was what they were talking about. Like, that was the allure of those two things represented the allure of the West consumer society, right? But also freedom and democracy and not a repressive totalitarian system. So so soft power is about the attractive allure of ideas. And that's what constructivism offers ideas about, is how does influence happen? Through ideas. And how do ideas spread? Through narratives, through stories. So like the Game of Thrones, like what AJ was saying about the Game of Thrones, like narratives, whoever controls the narrative controls this, the way people perceive things. There's this story about, who was it? Stalin, who he had a son, and his son was doing something, kind of trying to capitalize off of his name, Stalin. And he's like, hey, I'm a Stalin too. And his father says, you are not Stalin. I'm not even Stalin. Stalin is an idea. So anybody who's famous recognizes that, like at some level, you are not really you anymore. You are the image, that represents something bigger than you. Yeah, so I've showed you this before too, that social life is made up of ideas. We talked about social constructs, politics being part of the social world. And then, oh yeah, I think one of the articles I had was, made this point that culture is complicated. That's true. Like, is culture, like constructivism looks at culture, right, as part of ideas and stories and culture, ideas about identity, right? The culture is complicated. It's not like one thing. It's multiple things. It's like very multifaceted. And so, that was the article by Christian Roy Smith. But is anybody presenting on it on Wednesday? Yeah, Brianna. Okay, yeah. So I read that. So, yeah, that is really, kind of a more advanced article. So if you have any questions, to email me or something. But it kind of takes that, because it's written now. It's kind of trying to complicate that constructivist idea a little bit, but because we're so used to it now. So, and he talks about those two strands of constructivists, those who focus on international norms and those who focus on institutions. So this guy, Amitabh Acharya, is kind of a constructivist and a post-colonialist. Can you see why he is both of those things? Does that make sense to you? You're like, nobody's shocked here. Like, oh no, I thought he was a realist or liberalist. No, right? Constructivist and post-colonialist. How can you tell? Look at the titles of his books, right? Whose ideas matter? Constructing global order. The quest for identity. Anytime you see there's like 3 I's of constructivism: identity, interests meaning what you want, what you think you need, and ideas, I think, is the 3rd I. So the 3 I's of constructivism: ideas, interests, and identity. And there's also another, he also mentioned Hedley Bull. Who remembers who Hedley Bull was? I think I only mentioned it very, very briefly. It was in the textbook, chapter 7. Hedley Bull, he's an Englishman. Here's a hint. An Englishman, yeah. The English school, right? Yeah, that was kind of a precursor to constructivism. So constructivism didn't totally come out of the blue in 1989 and 90. It was, there was the English school, which was talking about states existing as a kind of society before that, and that was Hedley Bull. So he's mentioned here in this article as well. What did y'all think of the article? How did it go? It was longer than what we've read so far?
It was longer, but it didn't.
Was it longer? It didn't? Okay. How was the language? Was it very jargony? No, not too bad. I think there were some ideas, and I don't know if I have slides on them, so I may have to fit them in, but there are some ideas that I definitely wanted to talk about, go over a little bit, because they were a little jargony. And that's the epistemic communities part. But let's start at the beginning. Could somebody hit the lights for me? The front lights, so I can see, because I've got my hard copy here, well marked up. So a couple, key sentences. This is a good sentence to highlight. Something like this: the emergence of racism. This is right on the very first page. Scientific, profitable, offensive rather than defensive, geopolitical and normative basis for organizing the world order came only with the rise of European global dominance. Oh, so here's the answer to one of those questions: the racialization of slavery. So I'm looking for something that's like this. I didn't put down a page number. Y'all should put down page numbers. Yeah.
I pretty much said that just within a different way. I put it in my own words.
I don't expect you to have, the exact phrase things exactly the way, unless you happen to write down a quote that was about that. But yeah, the racialization of slavery just means that identification of slavery with a specific racial group. Remember, races don't really exist in a biological sense. They're a social construct, and that's why our ideas about how many races there are has changed over the years. Like we start out with I think the very first census has 3 whites and then slaves. Maybe there's like one other, something like that. The US Census starts out with those are the racial categories. And then now we have like 5 or 6. Is this, our ideas about race change over time because it's a social construct, right? So the racialization of slavery is that identification of slavery with the specific racial groups, because slavery existed beforehand, right?
The thing is,
We talked about ancient Greeks, right?
yeah, but we also said that in what may be transatlantic slave trade, that race essentially became synonymous with your
Right, right. So the ancient Greeks, they had slavery. And it was often like, who you caught in war, for example, and you could become free after a while or something like that. It wasn't something that stuck with you because of your, skin color or hair type or anything like that. It was, you were in a war and you got captured. The women and children were made slaves. They slaughtered the men. That's what happened with Menlos, right? So the racialization of slavery is that identification with it, and that's different. So these ideas were geographically widespread long term, and accompanied thinkers from vastly different theoretical traditions: liberalism, realism, Marxism. All of these theoretical traditions, there's thinkers there, and they all embrace that idea, that norm at the time, that the racialization of slavery was legitimate. So even these are very, very different theoretical schools of thought, right? They all have that in them because that was the culture at large, right? Wanted to do though, somewhere in here. Okay, y'all have the article pulled up? Second page, no. Third page. Okay, yeah, third page. So what I wanted to emphasize this week is in our little list of like how to analyze an argument, things that you're looking for, right? Besides the propositions. I should ask you guys, maybe y'all noticed, did you look for the propositions of the argument? A plus B equals C. Do you have ideas about that? Yeah, Kevin.
From pages 24 through 25, it says here divisions that, well, it actually just divides it. It says, I point to this article on page 24, specifically to the deep integration of racism, slavery, and empire in the making of the contemporary world order, led first by Europe and then the United States. Later within that section, it explains how they're going to do things by examining resistance, and then examining resistance to racism and the demand for racial justice and equality. And then finally, or second to last, on page 25, it says, second, this article argues for the close attention to be paid to the deep and symbolic relations. And then it ties it in with in concluding, I caution against the dangers of complacency and compartmentalizing the study of race and racism, and call instead for for racism to be viewed as an omnipresent global challenge, hence integral to the emerging research agenda of global IR.
So that's their answer, right? That's great. So yet again, we have another article where the author has mapped out their argument for you in the first couple of pages. First, I'm going to do this. Second, I'm going to do that. What I wanted to emphasize this week is looking at the evidence, like different types of evidence. Remember how I said each proposition has to be backed up by evidence, right? And then there's different types of evidence. There's archival evidence, there's statistical evidence, like if you have statistical data, you know, to support something that you're saying, that's really strong evidence. Kinds of evidence are there? Like the ones that most come to mind. Survey evidence, I guess, if you've done like a qualitative survey of people's opinions on something or other, then you have your survey data is your evidence. You use that to support a statement that you're making. Most people, you know, think slavery is wrong today. You know, that's that sort of thing. So this article, what kinds of evidence does the author use in this article? They say it right there on the pages that Kevin was talking about. What type of evidence? So if you've underlined a proposition, well, and let's go back and let's say, like, what's like the first proposition? Let me see, I have some stuff.
I think the first proposition is the one you had on that slide.
Oh, which one?
It's like the second sentence, the racism as a scientific, profitable, offensive, geopolitical, and
Yeah, okay. Well, is that the first proposition or is that his conclusion? Is that his answer to the research question? What's the research question? Let's start there. What's the question that the author is addressing, or the problem or the issue that they're addressing? What's the problem or the issue that they're addressing? Yes, Michael.
On page 27, I believe it's in this article near below. I consider the European and American world order a argue that these two phases differ significantly in terms of both their reorganizing powers and their institutional papers, but there is also much commonality between them.
What's the question? What's the issue? What's the research question here? What's the
That we view it in this way. And I think part of it is that
yeah.
that it's essentially become the global hegemon, as we said.
Look again at the title. Look at the title. Yeah, Samira.
I think the research question would be, is race and racism integral to the modern world order? And that would make the European part only one proposition, because we also dive into the American part in the second half.
That's a great point. I think you can even make it, you can phrase it slightly differently. I think that's perfectly fine. Yeah, what was the other hand here, Barney?
Maybe the first sentence, whether race and racism are part of the human condition.
No. The title. Yeah.
Is race and racism part of our world order? It's like, yeah.
Is it? Yeah. Okay. How about the origins? What are the origins of the modern world order? How about that for like the research question? Would you say like that's the answer that the author, like why, whenever you're trying to figure out what the research question, think about like, why did the author write this article? One thing I thought y'all would say, because some people have said in previous classes when I've taught this, is that the problem is racism. But no, that's not quite that's a problem, sure, but it's not the research question of the article. The research question is, how did the modern world order come to be? That's it. That's a great way to put it, because next week we're going to talk about the critical theories, of which postcolonialism is one. And that's the main thing for critical theories, are always asking, how did the modern world come to be the way it is today? That's like 50% of critical theory. There's another 50%, I'll tell you what the other half is next week, right? But the very first thing, the critical theorists are always interested in how the world came to be the way it is today. So yeah, but I think the way you put it, Samira, that also works. Like, is it because of racism? But generally, like they always tell us, research questions, they shouldn't be yes or no answers, right? It's always a why or a how type of question. So how did the modern world come to be the way it is today? And then what's the author's answer? That's usually the easiest one, right? Because they're going to tell you and you're going to know what their answer is if it's a well-written article, hopefully. This is what I want to know from your essays too. I should know what your answer is, right? That's the first thing I want to know. That's why I want it in the intro paragraph. What's your answer to the question? So whenever you're writing anything in academia, what's your answer to the question? That should be the clearest thing to your audience, to your readers. So what's this author's answer to the question, how did the modern world order come to be the way it is today? Yeah, Aaron.
Well, like Europeans brought in like race and racism, and they like made it, forged it, and as they like grew forward, that part became integral to this.
Race and racism was influential.
Yeah.
Yeah, that it was influential. That's it. That's all that their claim is. Yeah, this article also illustrates another thing that's really important for academia. You don't want to go too far out on a limb, right? You don't keep your claims modest, because then you can make a really strong argument. If you go too far out on a limb and you want to try to say something that's really, you get further and further out here, and okay, that's going to be groundbreaking research if you can totally back that argument up, but it's going to be really hard. This is an example of a very modest claim. Race and racism was influential. That's it. It's not a super, it's just a little modest. We get this all the time. Even in my dissertation, people are like, oh, you're making a claim. You're going out there too far. Don't go out there too far. You kind of got to sometimes, but yeah, this is a great example of how if that's their answer, it's not really ground. I mean, it's important. It's an important article, right? But he's keeping it. That's a way to make a strong argument is you don't make a claim that puts you too far out. Is you keep your claims modest, keep your answers modest, and then really, really back them up. And I think that's what this article is a good example of a modest claim that just race and racism was influential to the making of the modern world order. That's all he's saying. So it's easy to back that up. We can skip some of these slides. Let's start with this. We always run out of time in this class. We only got like 15 minutes. Why does Acharya say race is a social construct? Well, what is a social construct? Let's start with that. That's probably, yeah, head on.
Something, the social construct is something we make up to like better understand the world.
Yeah, it's like mental shortcuts. Because literally the world is very complicated. We have to have mental shortcuts. They're not necessarily bad, but they can become problematic, right? Like the construct of race ultimately became very problematic. So identifying parts of the argument, we've talked about what is the research question, what's the author trying to explain, and then we talked about what their answer is. So the next step would be identifying those propositions, because that's how did they get to that conclusion? How do they support their answer? That's where you want to be really careful about, like identifying the key propositions, because that's how you're going to identify the strength or weakness of an argument, right? You can say, the sky is blue. There's a modest claim, and you can have lots of evidence to back yourself up. But say that's not a good example. Say the grass is like purple. That's a claim. I'm going to have a hard time finding evidence to back. You want to know how I got to that conclusion. If I am saying that it's green, then I probably have an easier time finding evidence. I don't know, stupid examples, but you see what I mean? How do they get to that conclusion? So what are the first propositions? So looking at the introduction, page 23 through 25, he tells you these key points, right? That this article highlights the link between racism and the making of world orders, right? Racism plus slavery plus empire equals the current world order. That's how the world came to be the way it is today. So he says colonialism and racism are linked. Racial equality and human rights are linked. The UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, obscures those links. This is kind of something that you could try to do on your own as you're reading articles, is make a list of the bullet points of like what are the key points in the article, and it will really, really help you hone in on those propositions. Because you might find that one of your bullet points is a main proposition. you know. And then the last paragraph of the intro, yeah, tells you what the parts of the article, the argument are going to do. One, define key terms. Two, show how racism shaped the post-war US-led world order, what we call the liberal world order, or the LEO. And three, warn against the dangers of compartmentalization and faddism. What does he mean by faddism? Fad.
A temporary concept that is really popular, but once time goes on, it just starts losing traction.
So, yeah, just faddism, like, is it trendy now to study race? We don't want, warning against the dangers of that. It could become just a trendy thing to do. And that would not be, that's not what he supports. He supports integrating race and racism into the discipline of international relations as a whole. Right? Okay, so what are the propositions of this argument? Let's have some guesses before I put them up there. I think one other thing is that he divides the article into two parts, right? I think that might be the language that the author uses. Part one, first part of this argument is this, second part of the argument is that. Does anybody have this down in their notes? Like, what's the first part of the argument? But take a moment to look through your notes. I always call on you, so I'm always calling you too, Michael. Let me give you a moment to look through your notes. What's the first part of the argument? So remember you can look at in the beginning where they're telling you I'm going to map out the argument, right? Yeah, Samir, I always call on you too. I want to hear from somebody I don't normally call on. Yeah, sure.
I think maybe they divided the race and then affected in the United States.
Yeah, I think that is what I have. Conceptually linking race and racism to world order. So there's a definition of racism, page 25, and there's a definition of world order in page 26. Remember, he said he was going to start off by defining key terms. So, and then, yeah, was this the question I asked in the ICF? How did the transatlantic slave trade differ from other forms of slavery? And then here were the answers. So hopefully if you answered that question, you have stuff like this. And you hopefully wrote down page numbers. Remember, in last essay, I really want you to have page numbers for stuff. So you're gonna build your own argument. So you have to cite evidence from the text where you have a page number. So that you're going to have to build your own argument from your notes. Okay, so the notes that you have on the article. You want to get into the habit of putting those page numbers down. So the first way it's different, volume. Second way was qualitatively different. See page 28, visualization of slavery, page 28. How this influenced Enlightenment thinkers like Locke and Lord Shaftesbury, Locke's employer. That was that. We only have 6 minutes. Don't worry, I'm going to put these up on the Canvas page. Key concepts, racism. Whenever the author defines key terms, you definitely want to put that down in your notes, along with the page number where they defined it, because that's something that you might want to include in your essay, right? Definition of race. Definition of racism. Racism is not simple bigotry or prejudice. It's political and institutional beliefs, practices, and policies that reflect state power. Institutionalized racism happens both domestically within states and internationally. So one of the ideas that he's responding to in international relations, we had this idea that racism was a domestic issue. It's just something that states have to deal with internally. So if we're studying international relations, we don't need to study racism. After reading this article on the influence of race and racism on the making of the modern world order, doesn't that seem absurd? That was the predominant approach of the field for many years, that racism was just an internal problem for states. It wasn't something that affected the entire global system. But yeah, here's this argument that's making a very modest claim. Racism was influential to the creation of the modern world order. And now we all look silly. So yeah, definition of world order, like that. We have 5 minutes. They can go through a little bit more. How far did y'all get? Did you get through the whole thing or did you just get through the beginning part? I always try to make the questions for the ICAs on Monday, well, the beginning part of the article, just in case you didn't finish. And also, if you did finish, I really want you to go back and read it again. And so that I've scheduled like our readings to happen so that you do have time to reread. Because you so need to do that. How to reread stuff. After we talk about it, you can reread and see if it makes more sense. Did that help last week? Liberalism, did that help? Did anybody get a chance to reread? Not like I'm gonna tell you if you didn't, but it just helps so much if you can reread after the Monday lecture class, right? Okay, so common objection is that these people were products of their time, right? But what's his response to that criticism? Say, oh, well, John Locke, there's people, they were just products of their time. Yeah, Claudine.
There's people like opposing views and things like that.
Exactly, yeah. There were people of their own size who had opposing views. They were often silenced, stuff. So, yeah, products of their time. What was the standard of civilization? You remember? Yes, Mira.
It was, I'm not sure what the benefit was, but it was the qualification that I believe Europe was running where states could apply to be like of the standard of civilization, and oftentimes non-white countries like China didn't meet like economic or trade standards, quote unquote, and were denied entry to whatever club that let them in.
Yeah, it was intentionally kind of nebulous what the standards were. It's not like it was, oh, this thing kind of sort of changed. It was a little shadowy. Okay, second part of argument. Maybe, well, think about that. I'm gonna not put this. I'm gonna go back here. What is this? Think about this second part of the argument. So if that was the first part was conceptually linking race and racism to world order. What's the second part of the argument? Okay, but see if you can develop that for Wednesday. All right. So I'll see you all on Wednesday. We're doing a small group activity, and y'all stay dry out there. Try to stay. Oh, I forgot my Wednesday announcement. I'm defending my dissertation on Wednesday, 15 minutes after our class wraps up. I cannot do office hours at the same time. So, and I'm also probably not going to get here very early. So office hours on Wednesday are canceled. My office hours are before and after class, except for on Wednesday. So if you need to talk to me, we'll just work out some other time, okay? All right, have a good week.